Social networks never forget. So I searched in my personal archives. 2012, March. Had I liked or shared the most viral video in history? 100 million views in just 6 days.
You made it. Congratulations.
My name is Jason Russell, and this is my son, Gavin.
It was the story of a young American director, Jason Russell, who hoped his 30-minute video would facilitate the capture of a notorious war criminal in Central Africa, Joseph Kony.
So Gav, this is the guy, Joseph Kony.
He's the bad guy?
Yeah. For 26 years, Kony has been kidnapping children into his rebel group, the LRA, turning the girls into sex slaves, and the boys into child soldiers.
The video was meant to shock, to outrage.
To mutilate people's faces.
To bring Joseph Kony to justice, Russell even set up a private NGO called Invisible Children. Its internet campaign, Kony 2012, was a runaway success. Among those who circulated the video were a few of my friends. Until recently, I had forgotten all about the video and about Joseph Kony himself. Then, 2 journalists from our team entrusted me with this hard drive with footage shot in Africa in 2014. The starting point for my investigation. I set out in pursuit of the most infamous war criminal on social networks and of Invisible Children, the NGO that wanted to stop him. My first port of call was Gulu in northern Uganda, Joseph Kony's native region. I took the same roads that the directors of Kony 2012 took and met the same people. Former child soldiers of the LRA, the brutal rebel group headed by Joseph Kony. From the late 1980s, the warlord raided villages here to replenish his ranks with new recruits.
It was on Friday at around 10 a.m. in the morning. That's when they came to our village. I was just on the 9. And the second night, I was given some simple training about using gun and other things like that. And I realized that whether I like it or I don't like it, I'm part of the life now. So I have to toughen as a person.
The 3 filmmakers from Invisible Children turned up here in Gulu in 2003. I was able to track down the woman who served as their guide at the time.
And then I worked for a lot of charity organizations, and I went to the US to talk about the war in northern Uganda. And I started telling how I was a former child soldier and then how many kids are being abducted here. And that is where I received a lot of people who were very ignorant about the war. And when the boys saw, I always call them the boys, I'm sorry, but when the filmmakers saw this story, they contacted me, and definitely I would hear their story of how they wanted to talk about war in Africa. And I said, wait a minute, you want to talk about war? there's a war in northern Uganda. But because they were naive too, I drove with them to the north.
There was Lauren Poole, Jason Russell, Bobby Bailey. Those were the filmmakers. I worked for Invisible Children, and that's how everything started.
What they did, they made a lot of small videos about orphans, HIV/AIDS, and some of the victims of the war. And of course, the 12th documentary was Coin 2012. Bringing it out in 30 minutes. A war that had lasted for more than 20 years. To many people, it looked like a joke.
Since then, the naive kids have grown up, and their NGO is now based in Washington, like all successful lobbyists.
Hey, hi. Please have a seat. Yes, we're good. Just waiting for you. Can see just over here.
Before I could talk to the president of Invisible Children,
You can let me know if my hair will be a problem at any point and if I need to move it.
there was an endless back and forth of negotiations. In 2014, my colleague's request for an interview was declined. It took dozens of emails and months of waiting before I got the green light.
Can you remember what was the objective of the Coin 2012 video?
In hits per hour. 100 million people have now watched.
The main objective of the campaign was to push the U.S. government to remain committed to implementing its counter-LRA strategy, and then the deployment of the advisors was an outcome of that strategy.
Ready? In order for Coney to be
The video's explicit aim was to provoke the U.S. into sending troops after Coney.
They need the technology and training to track him in the vast jungle. In order to find him, the U.S. government has to deploy them. That's where the American advisors come in. Not for self-defense, but because it was right.
Politically speaking, it was hugely successful.
Hugely successful? Not really. 2 years before Coney 2012 became a global internet sensation, Invisible Children was already lobbying the Oval Office, as this photo from 2010 clearly shows.
I have authorized a small number of U.S. forces
I ordered a small number of American advisors to help Uganda and its neighbors pursue the LRA.
the removal of Joseph Kony from the battlefield. Sincerely, Barack Obama.
It's just a small step from garnering likes to dispatching troops. In the 21st century, a video can start a war. That's the Americans' helicopter, this villager says. The videos on my hard drive documented the U.S. operation. It featured some members of the 100-strong Special Forces team deployed by Obama.
May we have just a question with you? Is it possible?
Sorry.
We just wanted to understand.
Hey.
No,
No photos.
you don't want camera?
No recording. I know.
No?
No.
Somewhat surprisingly, an Invisible Children camp can be seen on the footage. Surprising because my colleagues shot the material in 2014 in the Eastern Central African Republic. By then, it had been almost a decade since Joseph Kony's militia had abandoned their base in Uganda. The remnants were holed up somewhere in a vast neighboring area between the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic. Here in Obo, hundreds of kilometers east of the war-torn capital Bangui, is where the Americans claimed that Kony and his troops were hiding. On the ground, my colleagues realized that not only was Invisible Children behind the deployment of U.S. Army advisors, the American NGO was also hosting military meetings. specifically for the U.S. Special Forces directing operations in the hunt for Kony and their allies, the Ugandans, who were carrying out their orders.
Now, which language are we going to use?
Good morning. Je m'appelle Kevin Leahy, Colonel Kevin Leahy. I'm the commander of the U.S. forces that support the African Union Regional Task Force in the LRA, bringing the LRA home. They will hear our message today and they'll understand that it's time to come home.
It's possible to do a little interview with you?
Absolutely.
That's 3 years. Americans are here, and Kony is still in the bush.
He's still in the bush, right? But his organization is coming out of the bush. It's, as you know, this is a gigantic area out here, and to find one person that does not want to be found is very difficult.
Fast forward 4 years. By now, the U.S. operation was over. The Army advisors had returned home, having failed to capture Kony. But why end a manhunt when the target is still at large? Had the most powerful army in the world been looking in the wrong place? Or did the mission have other objectives?
My family remained mostly in Uganda. My father was prime minister until that government itself was overthrown by the army.
Thank you.
After 6 years of intervention,
Right,
they didn't get Kony.
right.
Were they even looking for him?
Of course not. They were not looking for Kony. And in fact, it's hard to say it's even a success or failure, since I believe 100% that was never the objective anyway. This operation has cost more than $700 million. How is that possible? It only makes sense if that money was going to finance another agenda.
Who were the soldiers we filmed in 2014? What was the true nature of their mission? They were there under the banner of the Pentagon's Africa Command, AFRICOM. But it's not only a military command. According to this recently declassified internal document, AFRICOM comprises both military personnel and civilians. Protecting U.S. interests in Africa is one of its goals. Which interests? Diplomatic and military, but also economic, financial, as well as intelligence. Above all, AFRICOM operates in the gray zone between traditional war and peace.
AFRICOM is meant to intervene in a humanitarian role, so that is the official narrative. But the more geopolitical narrative is that the U.S. would be able to start sneaking in U.S. forces through Uganda and then spread it into the region to counter other interests in Africa.
In 2014, the people of Obo rarely saw U.S. Army Rangers on patrol. What they did see, though, was their aircraft, their helicopters, and their drones.
What we were doing there in Central Africa was effective integration of intelligence into operation.
Okay.
To that end, it's really enabling us that we could bring to bear, both in terms of intelligence gathering, and then also just in terms of like helicopters and air power.
Without the excuse of hunting down a war criminal, the U.S. military would never have been allowed to conduct an airborne operation over such an unstable, strategic area. Thanks to Operation Kony, it was able to map the area and install GPS beacons. Or in military terms, gather intelligence. But Central Africa is not just a region of military interest. It's also rich in gold and diamond reserves, along with businessmen ready to exploit them. This man, for example, on the left. He appears in footage shot in 2014 at a security meeting in Obo. That day, he was handed what was clearly a confidential map. He refused our request to film it, and with good reason. The map was addressed to the colonel of the American Armed Forces.
Ah, vous n'êtes pas militaire, d'accord. Je suis mon nom c'est Mark Pearson.
This is Mark Pearson.
P-E-A-R-S-O-N.
Apparently, he's a cultural advisor.
C'est-à-dire qu'il rapportait.
But what would a cultural advisor be doing in Obo?
D'accord.
And why entrust a cultural advisor with an American military map?
Parce qu'il y a le symposium demain. D'accord. Ok, je comprends.
4 years later, I looked into who Mark Pearson really was. Before following the American military into the area, he was employed by Gem Diamonds, a multinational diamond operation. It boasts turnover of some 300 million euros, with mines and prospecting projects all over Africa, including one in the Central African Republic. But the only area of diamond exploration officially declared by the company is in the west of the Central African Republic, 1,500 kilometers away from Obo on the other side of the country. So what was one of Gem Diamond's former employees doing here, in a region that harbors a wealth of gold and diamond deposits? In Kampala, the Ugandan capital, I needed to find out more about who was really running the country. Yoweri Museveni seized power in a coup in 1986. To consolidate his grip on power, he purged the country of many rebel groups. Joseph Kony's LRA, however, was spared.
Kony was a creation of the state.
Only a member of the opposition would talk to me about this angle of the story.
When I specifically look at the emergence of Kony, I can confirm to you with so many details that Kony was a creation of the government to fight the other rebel group, who were a real threat to state power. Because those fellows were well organized, they were trained, they were polished, they respected human rights, they never killed anybody.
So Kony could have been arrested in like 88?
Yeah, you know, Kony would have been dealt with in 1988. He did not have the powers, he did not have capacity, he did not have foreign support.
Without Joseph Kony, the Ugandan administration would not be able to make the justification that it needs more military assistance from the United States. It means it needs more weapons, and it needs more financial resources and diplomatic partnership with the United States. How would he be able to make that narrative without the presence of Joseph Kony?
That brings us to the least known and least documented part of the story. On the pretext of driving out Joseph Kony, the Ugandan army committed horrific atrocities inside its own country. Between 1986 and 2004, Museveni's army engaged in a bloody crackdown in northern Uganda. Officially, it was hunting down the LRA. Unofficially, it was crushing resistance to his rule from the Acholi people, the ethnic group to which Joseph Kony belonged and which had dominated the previous government.
In my village, a young man called the church who was complaining a lot. The army took him behind, threw an army uniform on him, and they came back and said, "This one is a rebel. We want to show you today that this is how we deal with rebel." So they tied him like Jesus was tied on the cross, on that tree, and they shot him with AK-47, 3 magazines, from toe to head. And they told people and say, "Shut up, if you do anything, we're going to do the same thing to you."
This very incident was detailed in a 1991 Amnesty International report.
we have no single incident where the UPDF was accused of intentionally going to a village and massacring people.
Are you familiar with the 2005 Human Rights Watch report about this conflict?
Human Rights of Uganda?
No, Human Rights Watch, the organization. No, you're not. Because in their 2005 report, which is the most exhaustive, they refer to torture, rape, willful killings on both sides, on the LRA side and also on UPDF side. So it's
No, in the case, first of all, we have our own Human Rights Commission report.
But you do agree that, for instance, in this 2005 report by Human Rights Watch, the words are pretty strong. Willful killing, rape, torture. This is not light.
Well, Human Rights many reports, some of them lies, some of them
this one was lies?
Not verified, yes. We have cases of murder. Murder of one person, murder of groups of people. But unintentional murders.
Why was the United States desperate to support the Ugandan regime at all costs, despite its abuses, despite the authoritarian rule of Museveni, president for more than 3 decades? Was it because the aging Ugandan autocrat was providing a few services to his American godfather?
It is true that America have condoned President Yoweri Museveni for too long. Today, as we speak, Ugandan troops are in Somalia. When Ugandan troops were being sent to Somalia, American officials came to lobby us in Parliament here to support deployment of troops abroad.
If you need somebody to be involved to help in fighting what's called Islamic terrorism in a place like Somalia, which is chaotic, and if Museveni is willing to do that, sending Ugandan soldiers there, I think that's a very easy decision for the U.S. to make, regardless of anything else that Museveni does, within Uganda itself.
A time came when the army went to raid the High Court in Kampala. Oppositions were arrested in total broad daylight. The Americans kept a blind eye. They never made a statement. They never talked about it because that was the time we were deploying troops in Somalia. So you're right, because America made Museveni who he is today. He has become a monster.
None of this was mentioned in the Kony 2012 video. Not a word about the Ugandan regime, about President Museveni, or about the war crimes committed by his army. Why not? And what exactly was Invisible Children's role?
When they say they're helping the widows or the orphans or so on, what are they really doing? Those are the sorts of questions that always occur in my mind. I came across them probably about 2 years before their big viral video, and I found their website and I looked at them and read what they said they were doing. Okay, so something about it felt very off to me. Their level of access to the region of northern Uganda, around 2005, northern Uganda was completely sealed off by the Ugandan army. The only people who got in, especially people with camera gear, sophisticated camera gear, such people did not get into northern Uganda without the express permission of the Ugandan government. Jason Russell and his team, they were in there because the Ugandan government wanted them to be in there. So why?
The small NGO was purportedly working to save orphans, when in fact it was promoting one of the most corrupt regimes in Africa.
This is our radio HQ, where we coordinate all the security information for the southeast of the Central African Republic. Every day we have a security round in the morning and another in the afternoon.
In concrete terms, it was nothing more than a network of informants scattered through dozens of villages. They were responsible for reporting the movements of active armed rebels without really knowing whether there were any small, isolated LRA groups among them or not.
Of course, definitely, that was more information than the military would have got because the radios were all over in the community. And then that information would be shared on a monthly basis. So it was voluntarily. Like in the meeting, most of the information would come through Invisible Children Radio Network. I knew about it and it was helpful for the intention, but I don't know how it would have been between a non-profit feeding information to the military. So we were kind of like, at the end of it, it looked as if we were the voice of the military. The LRA were children. If you're feeding the military to follow them and go and get them, you're actually killing children.
I met Jolie Okot, and she told me she felt really uncomfortable with sharing information with the military.
That's very interesting. I was not in a position of leadership that I am now at the time when Jolie was working with Invisible Children in that role, but my understanding was that that was not her sentiment previously. So
That's what she told me recently. So.
Right, yeah. My understanding is that that was not a sentiment that she held at the time that these programs were being developed. The concept of neutrality with the LRA is very different than in a context of civil conflict or intercommunal conflict. And so in that context, supporting essentially law enforcement and the protection of civilians, we felt like was very important.
Except that in the Code of Ethics for NGOs recognized by the UN, neutrality is non-negotiable. In fact, a non-governmental organization should always be independent of governments and armies. Invisible Children, however, has always collaborated with the Ugandan army and regime. Just like in February 2009. At the time, the Museveni government claimed there was a conspiracy afoot to overthrow it. Patrick Komakesh, who had worked for Invisible Children in its early days, was accused of being part of the plot.
The day I was arrested, only God knows what He did for me. I was supposed to die that very evening. I have been tortured in all sorts of ways that I've never seen in my life before. Like 3 months and 10 days. I remember one day there's a guy who was in charge of us prisoners who were down there. Came and was like, this guy from Gulu, is he still alive?
Patrick was eventually cleared of all charges. But who denounced him? The answer was hidden in a secret diplomatic note written by the U.S. ambassador himself in 2009, later published on the WikiLeaks website. Here, number 4, they say they foiled a plot against the Ugandan government and were looking for someone. Patrick Komakesh. They say he was then arrested thanks to a tip-off from Invisible Children. Even the American ambassador implies that the organization does the legwork for Ugandan forces.
By then, I'd already resigned. I was not working with Invisible Children at all. And I didn't know what happened. But this is a confession from the High Court. Somebody who is the highest senior officer who was so much in the center of this allegations, investigation, admitting that they got tip-off from Invisible Children.
His name is Patrick Komakesh. Does it ring a bell? Do you know him?
Uh-huh.
No?
Oh, no, I do know who he is, but I can't recall if I've interacted with him, and this If I heard his name, it might have been back in 2007 or something very early.
Do you know what happened to him?
No, I don't.
He says that he's been arrested because Invisible Children at the time gave a tip-off to the Ugandan security forces.
I have no information about that. And
How do you feel about that? About that Invisible Children would be able to do so?
well, I have no way of knowing if that's true at all.
Yeah, it is.
Sorry?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've met the guy. There is substantial evidence that actually Invisible Children at the time gave a tip-off to the Ugandan military and arrested him. And the guy was tortured for 3 months, and then he was cleared because he didn't do anything. How would you feel about that?
You said clearly you can't speak to this.
I have no information about that situation at all. Obviously, anyone who would experience something horrible like that is unacceptable. I have no information on that situation at all.
Another thing that bothered me about the Kony 2012 video was the evangelical, rather messianic tone adopted by Jason Russell. The founder of Invisible Children seems to regard himself as something of a pastor. His speeches are sermons.
Who are you to end a war? I'm here to tell you, who are you not to?
Here's the copy that was put out by Truth Wins Out, the gay rights organization I was working for. This audio I found of Jason Russell at the Gathering in 2005. The Gathering is the biggest community of Christian fundamentalist philanthropists in the United States. So here it is.
God said, Jason, open it up. And so with this movie, we are able to be the Trojan horse, in a sense, going into a secular realm and saying, guess what? Life is about orphans, and it's about the widow, and it's about the oppressed. And it's driven by an adventure, and the adventure is God's, and it's his story. And that's really been what Invisible Children has been evolving into.
Well, I was surprised that he would use the word Trojan horse, even at a conference such as that of evangelical Christian donors. I was surprised that he went that far to admit that the Invisible Children was perpetrating some deceit.
Is it true?
So I can't comment on what Jason might or have not said, but I can say very confidently we are in no way a religiously affiliated organization.
All of this was funded by an army of young people who put their money toward their belief in the value of all human life. They gave a few dollars a month of what little they had.
They say their funding comes from young people who give a few dollars a month.
As Invisible Children became better and better known, they were able to get small donations by presenting themselves as more or less a secular nonprofit, which was doing great things in Africa. But that's not where they started. They started with money from giant fundamentalist evangelical philanthropies that gave them seed money. This is the first year they're filing.
And so this part is the list of donors, that's right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of churches.
Yeah, a lot of churches, a lot of ministries. So here's the big one, the Provision Foundation, which is a subsidiary of the National Christian Foundation. And so this form lists $350,000, and I think they're one of the biggest grants they got in 2007. And the National Christian Foundation, it's a fundamentalist Christian philanthropy. They say in their statement of belief that the Bible is the infallible, inerrant word of God, and that we're about essentially extending the kingdom, promoting the kingdom, our kingdom, the Christian kingdom throughout the world. And
We are a nonprofit organization that's completely secular. that focuses on atrocities prevention and community resilience programming. So that's not a part of the organization whatsoever.
Can we go to Invisible Children website in order to see what they're publishing now in terms of text documents?
Yeah, that'll be interesting because I haven't looked at it. I think it's probably still at this. They're getting $500,000 from
someone,
but no names.
Oh, the names, yeah, the names.
No names.
When you go to the list of donors in your tax form, we can see that there is amounts of money, for instance, $500,000 from someone, but we don't know we don't know who it is.
That's something that we can follow up with you on.
Yeah.
I'd love to look at what it is.
Right.
Yeah, I could send you because it's interesting.
A few days after the interview, the Invisible Children press officer who cut in during the interview sent me this clarification. It guarantees that donations are from private foundations with no religious affiliation. I reply that I would like to believe there is no religious connection, but need to check for myself. Could I have the names? Since then, I've had no word from Invisible Children. But it doesn't end there. The involvement of another, more powerful entity in Uganda raises the question, who was really behind Kony 2012?
I'm the author of 2 books about an American fundamentalist organization with deep involvement in Uganda. The family, or the fellowship, as it's known, is the oldest and arguably the most influential Christian conservative political organization in the United States. The organization prefers very, very low profile. The more invisible you can make your organization, the longtime leader, man, fond of saying, the more influence it will have. He liked to refer to it as the Christian mafia.
Located close to Congress, this unremarkable red brick building belongs to the Fellowship. Its members meet here in private to talk about Jesus and business. But it won't open its doors to outsiders.
Its membership was not for the masses. They weren't doing any big revivals. It was for congressmen, business leaders, government leaders, and they play a major part in facilitating U.S. relationships with authoritarian figures around the world. That's what they admire. When they look at Christ, they don't see a model of love or compassion primarily. They see strength.
Could there then be a more ideal recruit for the Fellowship than the autocrat Yoweri Museveni? Authoritarian, vehemently homophobic, and evangelical?
The family looks at Museveni as their key man, as they put it, in Uganda, but also as one of their key men in Africa and one of their key men globally, saying, come to us, pray with us, do business with us. And they really take credit for forging that relationship at the beginning and turning Museveni into the American sphere of influence, where he has remained as a powerful regional proxy ever since.
In Washington, I was particularly interested in one member of the Fellowship, a senator named Jem Inhofe, known for his interest in African affairs.
I haven't spoken with him about it yet.
Okay.
I'll see what I can do, but probably not.
Hey, that's what.
Yeah.
Bye, thank you. Bye.
Inhofe was one of the stars of the Kony 2012 video.
Of all the problems that are out there, none is more severe than one that mutilates and takes the lives of little kids.
This senator, Jem Inhofe from Oklahoma, must be pretty close to the NGO, because in one of the other videos we have, we see him taking part in one of the NGO's protests. Here he is. His interest in Uganda goes back many years. In this press release from 2006, he was already raising the alarm about what he called northern Uganda's terrorist group, the LRA.
When I go, he says, I'm doing my Jesus thing. When he goes and meets with foreign leaders, he says, I'm a U.S. senator. I'm the conduit to U.S. power and money. And if you want to get there, you go through me and you go through Jesus.
The senator will not answer our questions. What's clear is that for decades, a radical fellowship has been pulling strings behind the scenes to get Uganda to advance U.S. interests. Kony 2012 was just part of a much more complex story. Incidentally, what happened right after the video's viral success? Once its makers collected $17 million in donations.
After Kony 2012, when our CEO decided that there was no funding coming in, and he made the decision to close the Invisible Children in Uganda.
The moral of this story is that there isn't one. In 2017, the U.S. government's development agency, USAID, awarded $24 million in grants to Invisible Children to fund a 5-year mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Today, Invisible Children gets most of its funding from the U.S. government.
To me, a founder member of the Invisible Children, and I'm the one who led to them to get this story. I felt hurt that this is our story that went out there and it was being managed by someone else. That is why I chose to continue with it, yeah, so.